Next, please.
Guess that's me, Toots.
This way, please. Now, name, please.
Joe, what's yours, honey?
The rest of your name, please. I have to get your card out of the file.
It's Harrison. No kidding. What's your name, honey?
Oh, here we are, yes.
Hey, where's the doc? I gotta find out if this arm's okay. I gotta get back to my bunch.
I'm in charge here, soldier. Now, we have to be sure that bone is knit properly. I guess we'll take another X-ray and...
Quit your kidding, you in charge. Oh, hey, we might as well spend the time pleasant like till the doc gets here, eh? Glad I still got one good arm. Here, sit on Joey's knee like a good...
Harrison, that's enough.
Why? How military. Don't let any of the officers hear you trying to impersonate them. They might not like it.
You may have overlooked one point, Corporal. I am your superior in rank.
Ye gods! I mean, yes, ma'am, Lieutenant, Gee, I didn't see them bars. You look just like a plain nurse in that white outfit and oh, yes, Lieutenant, my arm, Lieutenant.
Yes, sir. Things sure are handled differently in this war. We didn't get much of a chance to learn how the X-ray is being used from what we overheard just now. But in case you wondered what special applications the X-ray might have, though, we've arranged to devote this particular excursion in science to the story of radiology and X-ray in wartime.
That's right, Bob. And we're thankful to Herbert Mermagen, manager of the Industrial X-ray Laboratory of the University of Rochester, for the facts.
Industrial X-ray Laboratory? Well, we might as well be orderly about this, Emerson. How about a little bit of background first? How about the lowdown on the lab?
All right, Bob. During the summer of 1942, Dr. Stafford L. Warren, then head of the Department of Radiology of the University of Rochester's School of Medicine, was shown a photograph of a 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine by Dr. R. Plato Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz said that it looked like Dr. Warren's opportunity to obtain the high-voltage X-ray lab for clinical research, which he'd wanted for such a long time.
Do you mean the mere showing of that picture and a casual remark like that started this laboratory?
Well, at least it was the beginning of feverish activity around there. The picture, incidentally, showed an industrial 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine, which was specifically designed for the non-destructive X-ray inspection of rough castings prior to machining operations.
But wasn't that a far cry from work in a school of medicine?
Not necessarily, Bob. You see, Dr. Warren and his staff immediately laid plans for a clinical cancer research institute. The project, after approval of university administrators, was submitted to various Rochester, New York industries, who at that time were not only desirous of assisting in the development of such a worthwhile institute, but who were also highly interested in participating in the use of a 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine for inspection of war materials. The project took form in October of 1942, when ground was broken for the building which was to house this fabulously powerful X-ray machine.
They had to put up a new building? Why couldn't they have put it in one of the buildings they already had?
Well, no, Bob. There were three good reasons for having a separate building. First, in order to provide the necessary protection for the operating personnel, it was out of the question to install lead walls 3.5 to 4 inches thick within any of the buildings already there.
Why?
Because of the tremendous weight. And then the minimum height of a room is 20 feet.
And ordinary buildings don't have such grandiose proportions.
That's just about it. And then the third reason for a separate building was the industrial aspect of the project.
Just what do you mean by industrial aspect?
Well, I mentioned before that Rochester Industries were quite interested in procuring a high-power X-ray unit for purposes of inspection of those vital war materials they produced. Since these industries were to share the benefit of the availability of such a unit, it was imperative to provide facilities for handling heavy steel castings as well as to accommodate large trucks for transportation of these items. Now, all these considerations pointed definitely toward the need of a separate building.
Well, even I can see that now. And is everything going along as they planned? I mean, are they doing clinical work, research on cancer and all that, as well as helping industry by the X-ray inspection of castings?
At the present time, the laboratory is used only for industrial work.
Reneging, eh?
Well, no, Bob, not that at all. You see, when the plans for the institute became a reality, the University of Rochester was presented with the original experimental model of a 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine. Though this machine would have adequately served the cancer research problems, it was rather unsuitable for industrial research work, since it had a stationary mounting. It then became necessary to obtain another, more modern unit, which had all the flexibility needed for the intricacies of metal radiography. And since the most urgent need was for an industrial inspection tool, this phase of the laboratory became the prime consideration. They'll have to wait for a successful and victorious termination of this war before they're able to conduct the clinical cancer research.
A few moments ago, you mentioned metal radiography. What's that?
Metal radiography means taking an X-ray photograph of a metallic object in a manner similar to the way a physician takes an X-ray picture of a patient's lungs or stomach or broken bones.
But what can you see in such lifeless objects as steel castings?
Oh, X-ray examination provides a means of exploring the otherwise opaque interior of metallic castings and reveals any hidden flaw which might weaken the casting in important sections and therefore result in ultimate failure of the casting during service.
Can you inspect other materials besides steel?
Oh, yes, indeed. In the laboratory, they've had many occasions, Mr. Mermagen tells me, to X-ray steel, bronze, brass, aluminum, and even plastics, in addition to examining complete assemblies such as aircraft control mechanisms, small firearms, and many other things.
Haven't I heard that many industrial concerns have their own X-ray equipment? And if that's so, what's the advantage of the laboratory at the University of Rochester?
Yes, many concerns operate their own X-ray apparatus, Bob, but comparatively few have the advantage of a 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine.
Just how much of an advantage is that?
Well, the power of an X-ray machine depends entirely upon its voltage. That is, an X-ray machine operating, for example, at a voltage of 200,000 volts is capable of penetrating up to 2.5 inches of steel. Now, with thicknesses higher than 2.5 inches, this type of machine cannot produce a clear picture.
Well, then how far does this 1,000,000-volt job go?
Why, it is capable of producing a clear picture through thicknesses up to 8 inches of solid steel.
8 inches? I am impressed. I also realize there's some advantage right there.
And that isn't all, Bob. Previous to the development of the 1,000,000-volt X-ray unit, heavy steel castings, too thick for the conventional X-ray machines, were examined by means of radium. This very valuable material produces highly penetrating rays, and these can actually penetrate steel up to 8 or 9 inches. But, and this becomes a very important factor at the present time of emphasis on high-speed production, the time required for an exposure through 8 inches of steel with radium amounts to about 150 hours.
And how long does it take with a 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine?
Only 3.5 hours are required to do the same job, Bob. This large saving in inspection time means that production lines don't have to be retarded at any time because the number of castings which can be examined per day is increased.
Well, what does it look like, this X-ray machine?
Well, that's rather a large order, Bob, describing it. But I'll try to give you a mental picture of one. Incidentally, you may be interested to know that until only a few years ago, the status of 1,000,000-volt X-ray machines was such that they were considered strictly research laboratory instruments.
How do you mean?
Well, the physical dimensions, as well as their lack of flexibility, made them absolutely unsuitable for industrial X-ray work. These machines also required large amounts of auxiliary equipment, as well as physicists and highly trained engineers to operate them.
But they're more flexible now?
Oh, yes, indeed. Research conducted on improving the flexibility of 1,000,000-volt machines finally gained such a tremendous impetus through the war effort that in 1941 a new type of 1,000,000-volt X-ray machine was actually available on the market. And this type is now in operation at the University of Rochester laboratory. But now for that picture you asked for.
Well, I was wondering when we'd get to it. What does this monster machine look like?
Well, a cylindrical tank about 5 feet high and 3 feet in diameter contains both the high-voltage transformer and the X-ray tube. This tank hangs on a crane and is freely mobile in all directions, facilitating any position of the X-ray tube. The rather small tank was made possible through the use of freon gas as an insulating material. If oil were used for insulation, you see, the tank would have to be about 8 times as large, making the unit extremely unwieldy. Control has been simplified to such an extent that only one trained X-ray technician is needed for the operation of the unit.
Just wondering, Emerson, how about the future possibilities of the 1,000,000-volt laboratory?
Well, that, my friend, is very difficult to say. But I'll gladly give you Mr. Mermagen's version of the future. He strongly believes that industrial X-ray inspection is here to stay. Perhaps not for the extensive routine type of inspection we have today, but rather to assist the development of better and lighter castings and simpler production methods. Mr. Mermagen also feels that during the last few years, industrial radiology has made such tremendous strides that it may become important to institute training centers for engineers in this particular field. And then also the road is open to perform basic research about the behavior of 1,000,000-volt X-rays. And this field in itself will require much time for study. And finally, the clinical work of cancer research will be inaugurated at the laboratory directly after the war. And this phase of the laboratory will become an important factor in medical science.
Well, at this point, we'd better stop peering into the future long enough to jot down the facts about the scientific paper we're prepared to send to anyone who writes in asking for it. It has been especially prepared for us by Herbert Mermagen, manager of the Industrial X-ray Laboratory at the University of Rochester. To get your copy, just address your request to Excursions in Science in care of the station to which you are now listening, asking for scientific paper number 147, entitled Radiology and X-Ray in Wartime. That's scientific paper number 147, Radiology and X-Ray in Wartime. We'll see that your copy is forwarded to you free of charge. And now, if memory serves me correctly, this is the time we usually approach our question and answer period. I'll delay proceedings just long enough to explain that the questions you are about to hear, ladies and gentlemen, are actual questions submitted by you listeners. The answers are as sound and up-to-date as possible, since they are based on information provided by staff members of the General Electric Research Laboratory or members of other equally trustworthy institutions. Well, Emerson, time's a-wasting, so let's plunge right into activity with this inquiry from a man who writes that he read in a physics book that fresh eggs can be distinguished from stale eggs by their sinking in a salt solution, which will float stale eggs. He wants to know how to account for the change in buoyancy.
Well, if eggs are stored either at room temperature or in a refrigerator, they will slowly lose moisture because of evaporation through the shell. Now, as the egg loses moisture, the air cell increases in size.
Isn't that what egg candlers do when they hold the eggs up to the light? I mean, estimate the size of the air cell?
That's right, Bob. The size of the air cell is one of the principal criteria in grading eggs.
Then the density of the egg decreases in spite of the fact that the egg remains the same size and contains a solid material, whether it's concentrated or spread out.
Precisely. If the moisture is lost and
the egg decreases in spite of the fact that the egg remains the same size and contains a solid material, whether it's concentrated or spread out.
Precisely. If the moisture is lost and the relative size of the air cell in the egg increases during storage, the density of the egg would then decrease. Now, when the density of an egg becomes less than that of a salt solution, which our friend inquired about, well, then the egg would float.
Well, so much for fresh versus stale eggs. Now, here's one we might label moist versus dry air. For this listener wants to know if the popular reference to damp cold and dry cold has any scientific basis when the atmospheric temperature is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
Well, even though the temperature is below freezing, the air contains some moisture, but not as much, of course.
Isn't most of the moisture precipitated from the air at freezing, then?
No. As I say, the amount of moisture that the air can contain is much lower when the temperature is below freezing than, say, when the temperature is at 80 degrees in summertime. In other words, the air around zero doesn't hold much, but does hold some.
Well, our friend says we often hear people say that 0 degree Fahrenheit in a moist locality seems twice as cold as 0 degree Fahrenheit in a dry locality.
Well, that's probably true, Bob, for it is possible to have relative differences between dry and moist air, which would make a difference in comfort.
Next, we have an inquiry from a lady who asks what electrical appliances should not be touched when you're standing in a tub of water. We've all heard of cases where people have been electrocuted while standing in a tub of water and attempting to turn on or off an electric light. Our friend wonders if this also applies to a telephone or a radio.
Yes. Anything connected to a home lighting circuit certainly is dangerous to touch when one's body makes a good contact with the ground, such as is the case when standing in a tub of water.
But our questioner tells us that if this is true of the telephone, then the movies are setting a bad example. She points to 2 instances which illustrate this. How about that, Emerson?
Well, we checked with the manager of the local telephone company, and he says that he doesn't recommend using the telephone in such a case. He explained that there is a very special installation which can be made to serve this purpose, so perhaps our movie actors were using phones with such equipment.
Next, we have this inquiry from a friend who heard one of our recent discussions about the colors of the stars.
Yes, I recall mentioning the colors and the comparative heat of the stars. The red are relatively cool, while the white are much hotter.
Our friend points out that we mentioned that there were no white stars, just blue ones or ones which appear white.
That's right. We said that the white stars are the blue ones, really. Some of them may not be especially blue, but relatively so when compared to the cooler red ones.
Our listener wants to know why they're called white, if this is so.
Well, simply because they appear white, Bob.
Okay, now here's a good one. The young man asks, do goldfish sleep at night?
Well, I asked Dr. John T. Nichols, curator of recent fishes at the American Museum of Natural History, about that, and he told me that goldfish rest at night, usually near the bottom or near the plants or perhaps some solid object. They use very little motion while resting, just enough to keep them in position. They do not rest on the bottom, however, but how close this rest is to what we call sleep in higher animals, we don't know.
Well, thank you, Emerson Markham, and goodbye, everyone, until our next excursion in science.